Welcome, everyone. It's a great honour to welcome you to Braziers Park today. We're always pleased to see new faces particularly, and if your face is not new, we like it just as much. And welcome to this rather beautiful room, and above all to our speaker today, Rhodes. Chris is an international academic. He, I know, will be very aware of the veracity of everything that he is going to tell us. And I think I'm right in saying that in this community, which is very much dedicated to seeking solutions and alternatives, this particular subject will be very apposite. So, welcome and enjoy. Thank you, Chris.
Well, thank you for inviting me to give this year's Glaister lecture. In fact, last year's was the first opportunity I had to come to Braziers, invited by my friend over there, Alan Clark, who I know from Transition Town, Reading. Now, this is based on a lecture I gave to the Linnean Society of London quite recently, and it's a really quite broad church: the oil supply, biodiversity, the changing climate, really the whole lot. And the reason I use the word changing climate, not climate change, is to allude not just carbon in the atmosphere, global warming, and the consequences of that, but the fact that we are in the midst of a climate changing in all kinds of respects. Those I've just alluded to, our economic system, shaky as it is, and really a whole host of things, of which these are merely symptoms of the fact we are getting through our resources too quickly, too carelessly, and if we don't get away from our resource depletion, well, our resources are going to get away from us. So that's really the basis of this talk. So what I want to talk about first of all is the global oil supply. You can see the black bar on the left-hand side. That is the world production of crude oil. And clearly it has the lion's share as an energy source of all the energy used by humans on Earth. Very close to that is our use of coal, natural gas in a close third place, and then about 5 or 6% each nuclear and hydro power. And on the right-hand side, the little guy, a couple of percent, that is renewable energy, basically it's solar and wind energy. So you can see that basically we get more than 80% of our energy from the fossil fuels at the moment, and a couple of percent from renewables and nuclear and hydro somewhere in the middle. Oil is a very specific and particular material. When you just compare energy sources like this, it almost implies, well, okay, we run a bit short of oil, we can use a bit more coal or something like that. But oil, as I say, is rather specific, has a high energy density, it can be refined, that's to say distilled into liquid fuels, and really it's not just that practically all the world's transportation relies on crude oil, but really practically everything else that we do. And it's pouring this lifeblood, this supply of oil into global civilization that maintains it. So any issue over the supply of oil flowing into civilization is going to have profound consequences. Now this you might call the good old days. This is the Humphreys-Jones giant gusher, which certainly did what it says on the tin, drilled out 100 years ago or thereabouts in Texas. And, well, why do I call it the good old days? Well, because all you had to do in those times, before about 1930, was to drill a hole in the ground. And basically, for the amount of energy contained in 1 barrel of oil, or that equivalent, you got 100 barrels out, or thereabouts. That's like investing a quid and getting 100 quid back. Really good return, except you don't get 100 now. Globally, you get less than 20. You go to fracking. Well, you're down below 10, depending on where you're actually doing these operations. Go to heavy oils, bitumen from the tar sands. You might be down to 3 when you include the upgrading costs. So what's happened is we've got through much of the easily got and easily processed oil. So to maintain that overall flow of what you might generally call crude oil into a global civilization requires working on much more expensive to get and more difficult to process materials. And that's really where we are now. So the good old days are over, and we're now in rather leaner times. So the production of oil, the statistic is we produce something like 30 billion barrels of oil every year. I can't imagine what 30 billion barrels of oil or 30 billion anything actually looks like, but it's clearly an absolutely astronomical quantity. And that translates to 84 million barrels a day, or 1,000 barrels a second. Every second we get through 1,000 barrels of oil, or thereabouts. That's what it takes to keep this going, that level of flow of crude oil into civilization. The major producers of crude oil are Saudi and Russia, and between them they produce something like a quarter of the world's oil supply. Now, oil is a very various material. You hear the term light oil. That means it's basically very freely flowing. It's almost like light cooking oil. Now, the heavy oil isn't necessarily liquid at all. It's like the black stuff on the road outside. So there's a very various set of materials that are described under the label crude oil. Sweet oils, they're good, they're easy to process, they're very low in sulfur. The sour oils, they're much higher in sulfur, and it's much more costly and energy intensive. You've got to clean all that sulfur out, or it would corrode the inside of your oil refinery. And the light sweet oils are best to convert into petrol, and there are large quantities left in the Middle East, other places too, but the Middle Eastern nations are sitting on quite a bit of it. This is an exhibit from the Norwegian Museum of Science and Technology in Oslo. And you can see on this wheel there are different crude oil samples identified by the names on the right, some of which refer to Norse gods. But the whole point of this is that some of these are light in colour, some dark. As you turn the wheels, some of them just flow to the bottom of the tube, others more or less stay where they are because they're so high in viscosity. And you don't have to drill very far apart in terms of distance to recover totally different kinds of material because they contain different molecules. They're really rather different chemical materials. So the big question is, how much oil is there remaining? Well, much of the oil that's left contains a lot of sulfur, that's the sour kind, and it turns out it's the heavy oils that tend to be heavy in their sulfur content. So you've got the Orinoco Belt in Venezuela, which has 500 billion barrels or something like that, some huge quantity of oil there. But not all of it is recoverable. You hear other statistics like there's another 500 billion or who knows what barrels of oil to be got out of shale in America. And, well, only a small proportion of that, a few percent, is actually likely to be recoverable. This is the difference between a resource and a reserve. A resource is basically everything you think or hope might be in place, but, thank you, but a reserve is what is actually not only technically, but economically recoverable. And because the oil price has crashed at the moment, then the oil reserves globally have shrunk to an almost all-time low, because much of what is there is not economically recoverable at the moment. So it's all tied into the oil price. Now, shale oil, that's the term that you read in the media for oil that's produced from shale mostly, limestone as well sometimes, but through fracking. But oil shale, that's often not shale, but it's not even oil. It's a material called kerogen. And it's immature oil. If that had been stuck in the ground where it was hot enough by geology, it would have been broken down into something we're more familiar with, a kind of liquid material. So if you want to process this into oil, then you've got to heat it up to about 500 degrees centigrade. It takes a huge amount of energy. And in a nutshell, you probably wouldn't get much more energy from burning the oil than it took you to heat it up to get it out in the first place. And that's why there's been no serious commercial oil shale industry. There probably never will be. But really, knocking on from this, as I say, it's not only that the whole of the world's transportation is reliant on crude oil, but absolutely everything. Computers, cell phones. You know, it's a challenge to look around a room or sort of feel around yourself and try and find something that doesn't depend on oil at some level, at some point. So it really is the raw material for civilization as we know it. And most chillingly, I think that without oil and natural gas for nitrogen fertilizers, agriculture as we know it just couldn't exist. And this is the slide, the image basically that the poster was based on. And it really is significant when you start to look at what this is actually about. It's a real poster child for the unsustainability of modern industrialized agriculture for a number of reasons. Okay, well, for one thing, you need the oil to be cracked into diesel to fuel the tractors and the combine harvesters. And of course, when the food is produced and harvested, it's not just eaten there, it's moved around nations around the entire world. So you've got this huge dependency on the global food system, on oil. Another point here was at one time, this was actually a rainforest. This is a field of soybeans being grown in Brazil. And so basically, because they want the land to grow monoculture crops on, they clear the rainforest in various ways by setting fire to it, or by dragging very heavy chains through between a couple of tractors and tearing the trees out of the ground. Of course, this does the ground no good at all, and you can see this array of mighty machines doing their work. But what you can see they're doing, all this dust that's being thrown up, that's actually the topsoil being broken up. And these are monoculture crops with growing seasons as they are, and of course that ground is left exposed, and very often during the winter when the erosive forces of wind and water are at their most forceful. And so after a few years it's necessary to move on, get rid of a bit more rainforest, and it just goes on and on and on. Soil erosion, as I'll get into in the second part of the lecture, is really one of the greatest problems facing humanity, because we have growing populations and yet the quality of the land is declining continually due primarily to soil erosion. Okay, so the global situation, you can identify 98 oil-producing countries, the green chart at the top, but more than half of those, the red ones in the bottom chart, they're past their peak in oil production. And roughly speaking, the decline in conventional oil production across the world is about 3 or 4% per year. Now that means, putting it more simply, that we need to find a new Saudi Arabia's worth of production every 3 or 4 years. And if you're trying to fill that hole effectively, unidentified projects, this is euphemistically described as on this slide here, but that's a big hole that you need to fill from unconventional sources, like drilling in and deeper water, like fracking shale, like processing bitumen. All these more difficult ways of trying to maintain this overall flow of oil into civilization when you can no longer do it with the easy stuff. So that was produced by effectively the US Department of Energy. And so if we compare that with the sister agency, the International Energy Agency based in Paris, this is their World Energy Outlook. This was produced in 2012, but the situation is no different. It's just quite a nice illustration, so I've chosen this. But if you look at the dark blue bars at the bottom, well, this basically says what the other slide did from the US-based agency, that the conventional oil production is in decline. Peaked around 2005, and that's what it's going to fall away as these bars indicate. But it's a bit more optimistic because they've actually tried to identify alternative oil sources that might take up the slack, as it were. So if you look at the light blue bars, fields yet to be developed. Okay, most of these are in deep water, but they won't be developed until a barrel of oil is $100 or $150, because deep water drilling is very, very expensive. So again, that depends on the oil price. Fields yet to be found, well, yeah, okay, there's probably a few more around in deep water. Natural gas liquids, they're not really the same thing as petroleum, they're like hydrocarbons. For example, you can't easily make petrol from natural gas liquids. And just to point out, we sometimes talk of the thin blue line. Well, this is the thin red line. And light, tight oil that is the amount of oil reckoned to be produced from shale through fracking. Not a lot, is it? When you've got this massive fall in production, for all the hype there is about fracking, I don't think it's really going to come to our aid, even if we bite the bullet and take on all the other, we bear all the other issues that are likely to be associated with fracking. So, okay, if the oil supply it's not running out, we're going to be producing oil for decades, but as I say, it's maintaining that overall flow of 30 billion barrels a year into global civilization. So we've got a problem because we've got rid of we've got through the easy to process and easy to get stuff. So we need to find alternative fuels, but because oil is so ubiquitously used for all the materials of modern civilization, we need alternative carbon feedstocks for industry if we're going to try and maintain things in the kind of shape that they are now. The other aspect, of course, is that burning oil produces something like 30% of all the carbon emissions that can be blamed on human beings. And, okay, some people have argued, well, as the oil production starts to fall away, this must be a good thing, mustn't it? Because you'll have less carbon emissions. But naturally, of course, when you have a global civilization that relies on moving goods and people and energy and just about everything else around, as the oil supply starts to fail, then of course so does everything else. And trying to maintain what we have now is likely to prove extremely challenging, to put it mildly. So, I just want to look at a few alternatives because the main problem with an oil supply issue is a liquid fuels crisis. So other ways of getting liquid fuels of various kinds. So first of all, we can consider bioethanol. So this is a field of sugar beet growing in Norfolk, grows very well in this country. So the name of the game here is that you get your sugar out of the sugar beet, you ferment it into ethanol, and you separate that from the water somehow, and you get, roughly speaking, about 5 tons of ethanol per hectare. Okay, but if we were to provide all our liquid fuels in the volume that we use them now as we get them from petroleum, we would need basically more than half the amount of arable land we have available. So, to put it differently, if we stopped growing food crops altogether and we simply grew sugar crops, we could still only produce less than half our liquid fuels in the form of bioethanol. Now, that is a measure of the great volume of them that we get through. Cellulosic ethanol is often spoken of as a possible solution. But the truth of the matter is that you get about 5 tons if you were growing miscanthus, for example, another 5 tons per hectare, and you can use marginal land rather than prime quality land. But again, you would require very large areas, which is going to be a limiting factor. Also, you need special enzymes for breaking down the cellulose into sugars to be fermented, and they're very expensive. So at the moment, this is a completely uncommercial proposition because it would cost you 10 times as much per gallon of fuel from cellulosic ethanol that, say, for a gallon of petrol. So that's another limitation. Right, biodiesel is actually even worse. I'm assuming that we've converted all our engines to run on diesel, which would be a good thing in some respects because, to put it this way, you get more miles per gallon out of diesel than you do burning petrol in spark ignition engines. But you'd still need about 40 million tonnes of it per annum. So this time, cutting a long story short, if we stopped growing food crops and we just grew rapeseed for biodiesel, we could this time match only perhaps 1/7 of our liquid fuels requirement. So we really are limited. The other thing that's often not mentioned when people talk about biofuels is if you're using land-based crops, well, how do you grow them? How do you harvest them? With the same combine harvesters and so forth. So they themselves need liquid fuels to run them. And you would be lucky to have a break-even point between what you produced in terms of energy and what you required. Now, this is not the most prepossessing looking stuff, probably. This is algae. sometimes called pond scum. It's green because it contains chlorophyll in the same way as land-based plants do. So that means that algae undergo photosynthesis. They absorb carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, which builds the body of the algae, the same way that the body of plants is built from carbon dioxide and water driven by sunlight. But the idea is if you grow enough of this stuff and then dry it, you're going to get rid of all the water, which is another disadvantage. But that you could convert this into liquid fuels as an alternative to using land-based crops. And I must say that there are some potential advantages to this. So, for example, you'd have to grow them in tanks, but if you take that in terms of how much you get per hectare, the yield is between about 40 and 100 times better than growing rapeseed, for example. So, to put it another way, you would only need a couple of % of the total UK land area to provide enough liquid fuels to run all the transportation we have. You don't need to use cropland because you can stick the tanks anywhere. And there's a project going at Cranfield University, and the engineers there, they're figuring out how to float these tanks out at sea. So you wouldn't need to compromise land as you do with land-based crops. Interesting idea. You can grow algae well on saline water or wastewater, so you don't have the huge demand on fresh water that you do if you want to grow biofuel crops. And what I really like about this, although I don't believe for a moment we're ever going to get the equivalent of 30 billion barrels of oil in the form of algal biofuels, nonetheless, on a smaller scale, you could have a combination strategy where you can grow your algae and produce liquid fuels from the algae, but simultaneously you can actually feed them materials that you want to get rid of. So, for example, a big problem is eutrophication, which is the buildup of nitrate and phosphate in the water systems, which encourages the growth of algae you really don't want because that leads to toxic effects and dead zones and all this sort of thing, via the algal blooms. Okay, so if you can feed your algae the stuff you want to get rid of, and simultaneously you could also give them the CO2 emissions from a fossil fuel-fired power station, you've really solved two problems in one. And if at the same time you can create algae to produce liquid fuels rather than needing crude oil to produce them, then really that's a win-win-win situation. Now this slide here, it's an artist's impression, it's a computer graphic, but the idea is this great area of lawns, which is what the green is, these tanks basically containing algae, that you would put this installation next door to a fossil fuel-fired power plant pumping out CO2, and somehow you could feed that into the water that the algae are growing in. And if you also had a sewage wastewater treatment plant there, then really you have this sort of integrated structure that solves two problems, and indeed three in terms of what you might get out of the algae. So I like that as a kind of holistic solution. Right, I could hardly give a talk about oil without mentioning fracking. Now, hydraulic fracturing is the technical name for the actual process I'll describe in a minute, where you break the rock open. But you can see all this stuff has arrived in a town somewhere. And when this happens, when it all turns up, it's sometimes been described as being a bit like the circus coming to town. And of course the circus has to leave town eventually. But if you're bringing all these truckloads of stuff in, very often you've got to reinforce the ground, you've got to build new roads, you have a big pressure on the prevailing infrastructure, which sometimes has to be borne by the state or the local authority. But you bring all this together, you need the pump wagons, you need the wellhead, which is the thing that's left behind when the circus leaves town, and that's supposed to produce gas or oil for the next 30 years. Nobody knows how long these will produce for, because it's not been done on the grand scale or over a sufficiently long time scale to know as yet. But it's a fairly significant, and it's not a cheap operation. It takes a lot of energy and a lot of money to do this. But what is hydraulic fracking, and why would anybody bother? Okay, well, in a nutshell, you have some rocks that are called impermeable, like shales, and they contain gas or oil. That's fine, it's often very good quality oil. but it can't get out, it can't escape. So what you're going to do is break the rock open so that it can actually get out. So the way this is done, you drill a well, drill a hole in the ground basically, as is normally done, but if all you were doing was drilling vertical wells, because the shale layers are fairly thin, as it were, you would hit a relatively small volume in one go. So what's done is so-called horizontal drilling. So you drill down vertically, and then you mechanically turn the drill bit for about 90 degrees, and then you can drill into hundreds, thousands of meters of shale. So you can therefore access a very large volume. And you can drill around a sixpence, basically. You can do one well like this, you can do another, you can do another. You can drill around the circle, basically. So what you then do is you put down what's called a casing string, which is basically steel pipes screwed together, and basically that lines the well. At each stage of doing this, you pump down cement, so that holds the structure in place, but it's also supposed to provide a barrier which prevents what's in the well from leaking into the ground, basically. The only place that fracking has been done on a serious scale is America. And so what about doing it outside of the US? Because that's what some people are concerned about. Quadrilla, for example, doing it under Surrey, for example. Now the rocks are different in Europe than the ones in America. And so the likelihood is they will be less productive, and the quality of the gas may not be as good as was the situation in the United States. Indeed, they've drilled the sweet spots, the good rocks. Where they're exploring further out, the energy returns are much poorer, and it's likely, there's a paper that I mentioned here published in Nature a couple of years ago, where they discuss how good a long-term prospect it's likely to be, and it's not convincing, quite honestly. Shale gas, you don't know what the quality of the gas is going to be. I have a friend who's a Russian geologist, and he was talking about when they were drilling shale gas wells in Poland. And he said, did you know that in a lot of those wells, the gas that came up, which you hope to be methane, he said it was so full of nitrogen they couldn't burn it. So you don't know what the quality of the gas is going to be when you get it, and you don't know what the production rate is going to be either until you start drilling. So it's very hard to anticipate these things before you actually make a start on it. There was a report by the Royal Society a while ago which concluded that you could do hydraulic fracturing safely in the UK, so long as it was very well regulated. Well, that's really the critical point, among others. Are you familiar with the term Mamberland?
No.
Right, it stands for miles and miles of bugger all.
Say it again.
Miles and miles of bugger all.
No, the first word.
Mamberland. Yeah, there we go, Mamberland. Europe is not Mamberland, unlike the United States. Yeah. And what this refers to is that in the US, where most of the drilling, the fracking has been done, it's in wide open spaces where nobody lives. Of course, if you were going to start fracking the UK, this is very densely populated, so you're going to start doing it underneath people's houses. And another aspect, that would make most of us a bit nervous, I think, but another aspect, in America, the law is such that if you have oil or gas or something anybody wants under your land, it's yours. They've got to pay you money for it. In the UK, it wouldn't be that way. It belongs to the state, effectively. So you don't have any particular... If they want to drill under your house, you're not necessarily going to make your fortune from it. So it's a different sort of point. Anyway, concluding this, shale, as a geologic fact, contains more gas than oil. And so overall, as the thin red lines seem to indicate, it's not going to be a solution to the loss of conventional oil. It may buy time with gas, but I don't think it's going to change the oil situation. Okay, this is my moment to move on to biodiversity. Last year, the UN General Assembly declared it to be the International Year of Soils. And without reading all this lot out, the point was that, soils are being very, very heavily degraded and eroded. And what this was all about was to raise awareness, among everybody, but especially policymakers, about the importance of soil. Not only that you need good soil if you want good quality land to feed everybody, but there is an intimate connection between the biological water cycles and the carbon cycles. So soil is really quite central to all of this. So if you want to adapt to climate change and mitigate the worst effects of that, and if you want, as I say, to feed everybody in the future, you want to carry on with sustainable development, then you need to preserve and build the soils. And that was really what that was about. So there was a lot of good information around. What difference it will make is a moot point. But okay, this is the problem. Soil is being degraded mostly by erosion. 85% is probably basically the fact that stuff gets blown or washed away. Other effects too, compaction of soil, that has a bad effect in all sorts of ways. As you lose the organic matter from soil, it loses its structure, it loses its ability to absorb and hold water, and it starts to become depleted of nutrients when these processes take place. And these overall effects cause a loss of the soil biodiversity. And soil is remarkable because it contains 1/4 of all the biodiversity on Earth. That's to say 1/4 of all the organisms on Earth, mostly bacteria. They actually live in the soil. So it really is critical to maintain and preserve soils. This is a global phenomenon, as you can see. Very degraded soil, those are the ones marked in red. There are different definitions for these things, but very degraded soil has been explained to me as being land that's lost something like 70% of its topsoil. So it really is fairly heavily degraded. And it's going on across the world on an alarming rate. So a few interesting or frightening facts about soil. So for a start, 1/4 of all the Earth's biodiversity is in the soil. So how we treat the soils has a big impact on the biodiversity of the Earth. Over half the land used for agriculture is moderately to severely affected by soil degradation, mostly through erosion. Now it takes, depending on the climatic conditions, somewhere between, say, 200 and 1,000 years to form an inch of soil. But soil from agricultural land is being lost many, many times faster than that, up to 40 times. And in the last 40 years, something like 1/3 of the world's cropland has become unproductive as a result of soil degradation. About half the world's livestock are vulnerable to degradation, especially if this is exacerbated by climate change. And, well, in a nutshell, we need to produce 70% more food by 2050, not only because the population will be greater, but of course there'll be more meat eaters because people will be more affluent. Now that seems to be a correspondence between people having more money, they tend to eat more meat. And so we need all this. We're trying to drag more and more out of the land, and yet we are degrading it. This seems to be two forces that are really working in totally opposite directions. You're probably aware of this, many people are not, is that there is a soil-water connection, that the soil is an implicit part of the natural water cycle. And so basically, if you've got good quality soil, it's got good structure, it's covered, it's not compacted, it acts like a sponge. So the water that is evaporated into the atmosphere rains down, the soil soaks it up. That's great. If the soil is covered, this tends to mitigate against erosion of soil. But also, if the water is absorbed, you have less runoff. So, if you like, there's less erosion further down. Also, the aquifers are recharged if the soil is able to absorb the water properly. But if you get this wrong, which is what happens at the moment, you get your soil and your water in the wrong places. So you have water shortages, you have flooding, and you have this overall impoverishing in the quality of the soil. So it's important to do these things. Covering the ground is absolutely critical. So putting this in more straightforward terms, and this paper is quite interesting. This shows that if you cover your ground to the extent of 20%, then you lose maybe an inch of soil in 25 years. If you cover it to 80%, then that rate of erosion is reduced to 1/10. So you lose an inch of soil in 250 years, which is practically the natural rate of soil production. So by covering the soil, you bring the erosion and the creation of soil back into balance with one another. So that's really what this paper is showing. How do you protect and regenerate soil? Well, as I say, cover the ground, reforestation, planting trees. I must confess that a long time ago, I could never understand why all these green folk wanted to go around planting trees everywhere. I just didn't quite understand it at all. But that was in my ignorance, where I didn't realise how important trees were in all sorts of different ways, their connection with the soil. Indeed, recent research has shown that soil that has trees planted over it is much, much more effective in absorbing water, for example. So it's all tied in. You plant cover crops, peas and beans, for example, they're nitrogen fixers, so that contributes not only to the organic matter in the soil, but to the organic nitrogen content. All sorts of things you can do. Trees provide windbreaks, which also reduces the level of erosion. There's a procedure called farmer-managed natural regeneration, which is sort of grand-scale pruning. So basically, in Niger, they managed to bring back 5 million hectares of barren land to life at a level of 40 trees per hectare. And essentially, you just chop away anything that's growing and preventing the trees from growing. Of course, land-based plants, especially forests, produce a large component of the nitrogen in the atmosphere, so that's another good reason for having them. And effectively, with your good soil, building the structure and the soil organic matter content, you build the soil food web. The soil food web, those are the organisms, primarily bacteria and fungi, but that live within the soil itself. It's reckoned that in healthy soil, you get something like 1 billion microbes in a teaspoonful. So that's really quite amazing. The soil food web, this is one description of it. You've got the different trophic levels, from the very simple single-celled bacteria and fungi. And effectively, all these creatures eat one another and their excretion products. So that's why it's a web rather than a chain. And if you want to know if you've got good soil with all this stuff going on in it, you don't need a microscope to look at these things. If it's full of earthworms, if your compost heap, your ground is full of worms, it gives you a good indication that all this other stuff is in place, all these other creatures are there. So the soil food web is a really critical, critical component probably of soil. Now, this is quite interesting. This was in the Independent recently, and it was basically saying Britain has only 100 harvests left. Right. Now, what does that really mean? Well, this was a study that came out of Sheffield University, so I phoned up Professor Dunnett and I said, did you really say this? He said, well, no, not exactly. He said, but the point was that there will be a crisis due to the impoverishment of soil due to industrialised agriculture at some point during this century. Wow. And so what they're really saying is that if you compare land that's farmed on the commercial scale compared to land that is used by people on the smaller scale, then that is much better quality, the latter. Where land is actually tended by people rather than machinery being used, it has much higher levels of nutrients, it's got more organic matter, it's got better structure, it really is better stuff. Also, as we know, there is a problem with the pollinators dying off. So the soil and the biodiversity beyond the soil, they are intimately connected. So by rebuilding the soil, we start to rebuild everything. So how do we tend land on a small scale? Dig for Victory during World War II, that was very successful. It enabled people to grow quite a significant proportion of all the veg that was consumed during that period, where the boats, the ships bringing food in from elsewhere were being torpedoed by the U-boats and so on. But what would be a good method for growing food on a small scale? Well, I would like to raise mention of permaculture. You're probably familiar with permaculture, quite a few of you, more than most audiences are. Okay, well, permaculture, for the benefit of those who are maybe less aware of it, I'm not going to go into this in any detail. It's a portmanteau word, stands for permanent culture or permanent agriculture, and it was invented by a couple of Australians about 40 years ago. And the critical aspect, as I see it, of permaculture is it's not just sustainable, which is great, it means you can carry on doing the same things, but it's also regenerative. So, for example, you can restore highly degraded landscapes using permaculture methods. And there are fantastic projects across the whole world where this is being done. So for example, there's the Chikukwa project in Zimbabwe. And over 25 years, they managed to restore to verdancy a highly eroded and degraded landscape. And these principles, I mean, permaculture is not a thing, it is a design system. You can grow it not only to how you treat land, but any project at all. You know, it really is the whole being greater than the sum of its parts. You put the critical elements together in the right way, the critical people, whatever components you are, depending on what you want to do. There are lots of quotes to Albert Einstein. I don't know if whether he actually said this or not, but it's a good one. He said, or whoever said it, said, "You cannot solve a problem from the same consciousness that created it. You must learn to see the world anew." And that is really what applying permaculture is to me. It is a different way. It's getting away from linear models of growth. It's a more sort of holistic, integrated way of designing and putting things together. Well, the overall advantages here are many, but certainly you can get away, because you build your soil structure, you need less water and application of artificial fertilizers. But what permaculture does, because you can put these different elements, these different plants and so forth together, is to exploit the third dimension. So plants grow at different heights, so some of them shade others, some, the taller ones, get the benefit of all the light there is in terms of photosynthesis. But of course the roots go to different depths in the soil, so the third dimension is being exploited there, because the roots are extracting nutrients at different depths too, principles. And this is David Holmgren's 12 principles. You see in the middle the 3 permaculture ethics. Care for the earth, yes, don't degrade the earth, care for it. Similarly, don't degrade people, care for them. And then fair shares, that's often taken to mean don't take more than you need, but it's also about return of surplus to the whole ecosystem. So collectively, everything in it benefits. And the one down the bottom, produce no waste, because there is no waste in nature, in a forest. Everything from the leaf litter, it's just consumed by the fungi and returned to the soil. Everything is recycled. It's a perfect recycling mechanism, which is a better way of approaching things than the linear model. Forest garden and the principle of layers. It's more or less what I was saying, that you can exploit the third dimension. So you've got a tall fruit tree, you've got other trees and shrubs that sample different, their roots sample different depths of the soil, and they have different effects in terms of how they take the light or shield others from the light. Well, if you want to see whether this may work in practice, one of the best examples I've come across is the Risk Roof Garden in Reading. Have you been there, some of you? Yeah, okay, right. This is one of the most amazing things I've seen, you know, in terms of its importance. It's the Taj Mahal, you know, it's really quite wonderful, because all this stuff, it looks like a jungle, doesn't it? I mean, there's a 20-foot cherry tree up there. All this lot is growing in about a foot of soil on the roof of a building, RISC, the Reading International Solidarity Centre, in the middle of Reading. So you think, well, if you can do this on a roof in the middle of Reading, then it shows what you can do with urban space that you might not normally think would be much use. There were many reasons for doing this project, but that was one of them, to show what might be done with urban space. So here's a few more pictures of it. I mean, it's just amazing. As I say, there are different trees, there are shrubs. There are about 200 different plants up there altogether. But it's almost been a bit more successful than was hoped. And now they're getting the engineering department at Reading University to recalculate the stresses on the building. It's a strong building. It used to be Blackwell's bookshop, so they used to store the books upstairs. So there's plenty of iron girders and so forth. But it could be an issue at some point. I calculate there's a good 100 tons of stuff up there altogether, so we see how we get on. Okay, the final point in the title, the changing climate. As I alluded, I don't tend to use the term climate change, because carbon emissions and climate change, that's just really one element of the main problem. And all these different things are the problems that face us. Population, what are we going to do about it? 11 billion by 2100. Peak resources, whether it's oil or uranium, you know, the fish stocks in the world have peaked now, the soil has peaked. You know, we've got through, 10 years ago we had more good quality soil covered land that we do now, so it's all going in the wrong direction, all sorts of issues. We're thought to be in the midst of the 6th great mass extinction, meaning the loss of biodiversity now is at least as great or more than it was in the previous 5. So it's not looking good. All these other things, people are too fat, they don't get enough exercise. Nature deficit disorder, it's thought that children don't get out in nature enough, and it's possible to improve people psychologically, treat depression, treat young offenders by getting people out in nature. It's just more where we ought to be rather than where we spend our time or are forced to spend our time in the world we're in at the moment. And, well, there are all these problems, basically. I describe them as the world's woes. That is the changing climate. But I don't view these as individual problems, but symptoms of a single problem, which is basically overconsumption, using up our resources too quickly, and with no regard, in that linear growth model fashion, and not regarding what the consequences are, what, like the soil food web, what the excretion products of our use of our resources are. And it's been described not by me as the sins of the fathers, which is a sort of impoverishing scenario where things get worse on worse generation on generation from both having less and less resources available, but also having to deal with the pollution. And I would offer growth, where basically growth is possible, if no longer globally. We can grow how we do things on the smaller scale, including using permaculture methods, and as a way of addressing how we use our resources better in a more sustainable way. So if we start to do this, we can start to build the soil with carbon effectively taken from the atmosphere, which has positive effects on climate change. And there are many studies that show that more biodiverse systems are more resilient than monoculture systems. The Rhodes Institute in America, they've run 2 systems for about 40 years. And among the many things they show, one, that with their system, using no artificial inputs of fertilizers, there's not really any lower yield than the conventional. Well, conventional, this has only been going for about 60 or 70 years, but industrialized, that's what I mean. And also, in times of water stress, they find their system is more resilient. The yields are maintained compared to the case where you use the more industrial approach. So, quite interesting. I like this cartoon. So, loss of biodiversity. You've got this chap here, he's about to take the family off in the car somewhere for their entertainment, and he's looking over the wall at his neighbour, who's in his very messy garden, playing with his family, or sleeping, or doing whatever, and he says, "You should concrete over, it makes life so much easier." And there is a sort of point there, if simple is what he wants compared to the rather messy life he sees his neighbour having. But of course, concreting and tarmacking over the ground is a very good way of stopping it from absorbing water, and this contributes to many of the flooding and also drought conditions across the urban world. Carbon emissions and climate change. Yeah, there was a paper published in Nature at the end of last year, which estimated that for a 50% chance of avoiding the 2-degree increase in the mean global temperature by the end of the century, it would be necessary to leave a third of the world's oil reserves, half the gas reserves, and 80% of the coal in the ground up to 2050. And they say that the idea of developing resources in the Arctic and increasing unconventional oil production, i.e. from oil shale, for example, are incommensurate with efforts to limit average global warming to 2 degrees throughout the 21st century. So in other words, we've got enough already, or access to enough already, without really working harder and harder to get hold of more of the unconventional stuff. Because if we do that, then we can probably cut the planet 3 to 5 times. I tend to think more in terms of production rates rather than static reckoning. And so what this seems to work out too is we need to reduce our production rate of oil by 5%. Well, that's not difficult, that's going to happen to us anyway. We need to grow our gas production rate by 60% and cut our production of coal by about 70%. Effectively, you've got a big substitution of gas for coal. And if you did that, then you could cut carbon emissions from 48 billion tonnes of CO2 equivalent in 2010 to about less than half that by 2050. And yet, if you look at the BP statistical review, which I think is a more reliable indicator of what's really happening, it indicates that by 2035, let alone 2050, although there will have been a substitution of gas for coal, still our carbon emissions will have gone up by 30%. So it'll be more like 50% by 2050. So you seem to have the forces of what we need to do if we really want to trammel ourselves in within this temperature limit and what's actually happening. They seem to be going in almost symmetrically opposite directions. The future of energy. Well, just to sort of round things up. Okay, in my opinion, the most important thing we can do, even more than trying to say, can we get more oil or gas out of shale, can we dig more coal, how deep can we go in the water, can we get more bitumen? We need to look toward energy efficiency. So, for example, buildings need to be much better insulated than they are now. Draft busting, there's a man called Tony Cowley in Reading, a really good guy. Among the many things he does, he goes round and he shows people how to draft proof their houses. It saves a huge amount of energy if you do that. Very, very important. It is thought there may be limitations to how much renewable low carbon energy, solar and wind, could be got quickly enough. And some people, I don't really have an opinion on this, but for this reason, some people are looking toward nuclear power and thorium reactors, for example. I mean, the main reason we have a uranium-powered nuclear power industry is because they wanted plutonium to make atom bombs. It wasn't just for energy or electricity too cheap to meter. Thorium would actually be a much safer way of doing this, but I just throw that on the table. I think certainly because of the oil supply problem, we're going to need to reduce our level of oil fuel transport, and that will necessitate doing things on the local level much more, growing food and producing energy and many other things. And the other point is there is a nexus between these different factors. As I said, soil and water have this connection through the hydrologic, the water cycle, but also all energy sources, they're incredibly thirsty. It takes a lot of oil to mine coal or produce oil and gas. Really all of them, if you want water to cool nuclear power plants generally. It's reckoned it will be necessary to grow our use of water, our flow of water into the mechanism of civilization by 85% within the next 20 years if we want to increase our energy as is anticipated. And it may be, because we're already on a water-stressed planet, as things are, over-pumping aquifers, it might be the amount of water available that will set limits to how much energy we might be able to produce in the future. And as I say, the rebuilding and protection of soil because of that nexus too. And I think it's true to say that you can't decouple, for the reasons I've mentioned, our use of energy from our use and the availability of water and soil. And so we need to think in a more integrated way to produce a durable, sustainable system that meets human needs, but isn't going to just collapse at some point. And yeah, whether it's a curse or not, we certainly live in interesting times. Okay, I will stop there. Thank you for listening to me.
I'm sure there are questions. Are you happy to field your own questions, or do you wish to be chaired?
Oh, I can feel it myself. Okay, the man at the front.
I'm getting a picture of the way that fracking works, where these collars of steel tubes are connected together, you cast a concrete casing around,
Yeah.
you go at 90 degrees across, so
That's
you
it.
have more range and scope.
Mm.
But I don't understand where you start blowing things up and where the pressures
Oh.
come in, so I just want to know.
Yeah, okay. As I said, you put these across the oil industry, and basically whether you're putting your drill string together, that's, yeah, the pipe you need to drill the stuff out in the first place, or the casing string, which is the steel tube that you use to line the well. They come in 40-foot length, and they're screwed together, and the thickness is about so, basically. Okay, but if you want to make some sort of ingress into the shale from that, you need to blow holes in it. And you can blow those holes, you can create those holes where you like by putting this perforating gun down, which has the explosive charges. And what's actually done, it's done in sometimes up to 30 stages, because some of these horizontal wells, they can be, a mile or so, basically. And so this is actually a very convenient way of doing it. You think, right, okay, we're there. They can tell with their equipment where it is, right, they know where the shale is, right, blast, blow the holes there, so on and so on. And so at that point, having created those holes in the pipe, the rock is kind of exposed. And you then pump the hydraulic fracking fluid down, and then that comes out of the holes and into the rock. And as the pressure increases beyond the mechanical strength of the rock just cracks open. And shale, it's layer on layer on layer, and you're kind of breaking these apart. That's why you need the proppant to hold the layers apart after you've done it. And so it's actually a convenient way of doing it. There are other ways of doing it, but this is the most commonly used one. You know where you are with a bit of explosive. Yes, sir.
I'm fascinated by the idea of having an electric car, but I'm not going to at the moment because I have to take electricity from the board. However, the board is going to make it with coal or whatever.
Yeah.
I'm also fascinated by the idea that in Iceland they're having hydrogen cells. It seems to me a very clean way of doing it. The only effluent is water, which we can put up with. And you haven't mentioned hydrogen cells, but maybe it's such a minor thing that it's not very important. It's rather volatile.
Iceland is in a rather unique position because they're sitting on the North Atlantic ridge. In other words, basically, the two halves of Iceland are separated. So they've got molten rock, very, very hot. It's much easier to extract huge amounts of geothermal energy that way than we could under Oxfordshire. So that's a real advantage. And of course, if you have a cheap source of electricity, it's clean, no reason to not use hydrogen, fair enough. But as you say, our main sources of power at the moment are the fossil fuels. So we would need to really ramp up from about 2% to substitute the 81% to start to make a significant difference. And it's not until we increase, and I don't know that we could do it, by some huge number, our amount of renewable energy that we could even consider doing things like this. Now, some people consider we should build more nuclear reactors as the low carbon energy source. But you're right, because if all you're going to do is make your electricity in a standard coal or gas-fired power station, it really is rather a waste of time to make clean hydrogen. It's often described as carbon's dirty secret. If you look at the statistics, it's really quite interesting. If you have a car that burns petrol and you have an electric car, depending on how that particular nation makes its electricity, your electric car can actually be dirtier when you consider what's called the tailpipe end than a reasonably efficient liquid fuel burning car. If you're in France, well, you're laughing because they make 80% of their electricity from nuclear power. So in terms of carbon emissions, go to France and have your electric car and you're really contributing to saving the planet. But in India, for example, and China, where they make much of their electricity from coal, then it can really be the other way around.
Our roof panels, PV, would be very helpful in bringing it.
Definitely. I think that there is no single solution, and what the solution is a mix of smaller solutions. We're going to need an energy mix, basically. But as I said, that's going to be combined with doing things on a more local level and using our energy more efficiently. Yes.
I understand that the waste products of thorium, energy production through thorium, are far less toxic than from conventional nuclear. What are the prospects, do you think, of the government actually considering it seriously as an alternative to nuclear?
I mean, our government, that's a debatable point. The Chinese government are putting a lot of money into thorium reactors,
Yes.
so they're taking it seriously.
Yes.
Because China is considering clean energy very seriously. They burn a lot of coal at the moment because they have it. But I think our government is fairly reactionary. And they would think thorium, you know, what's wrong with what we've got now, kind of thing.
Yeah.
But yeah, my understanding is there are many advantages to thorium. Another thing is in terms of if somebody wanted to have a bomb in a suitcase, with thorium, that's right, it's uranium-232. The fissile nucleus you get from thorium is uranium-233. It's thorium goes to uranium-233, similarly to uranium-235 as we use in standard power stations produced by uranium enrichment. But there's also a contaminant, uranium-232, which is a very strong gamma emitter. So it would be very, very difficult to shield that. You know, if you had if you had that much lead in your suitcase, that would slow the alpha particles down, and you probably couldn't detect it very easily. But this contaminant would make it very, very difficult to proliferate. Yes, you.
I like experimenting in small-scale projects, and I don't know anything about this fuel from algae, and I'd like to know. We have about 2 or 3 buckets of food waste every day here. Could that be used in a small-scale scheme to grow algae?
It might need to be processed into some form. I mean, when they grow algae normally, what's done is the nutrients are added as soluble phosphate, for example, and carbon dioxide is pumped in. I'm not aware of, let me think. I think the answer to your question is yes, but you would need the right sort of arrangement. You might need to process your food waste in some way that it's not lumps of it, it's like a sort of slurry. You need a sort of stir in there so that it's being constantly kept in suspension.
So make one of those.
Right, okay. Okay. Oh, well, it's a possible project then, yeah, okay. Yes.
Your talk has been so interesting, thank you. And I think a lot of us are aware of these problems. But could you give us some insight? You are advisor, I understand, to the EU. And how is the EU and how is the British government? Are they seriously looking at these things? Or, for example, I heard that fracking had been banned in Germany. They just said, no, we don't want anything to do with it. Could you give us an update as to what's happening in Europe with regards to this thing?
Yeah, fracking is highly contentious, as we know, but I think the difference between Germany and many other countries is a very, very strong green force within its government. And so the fears over the contamination problems and earthquakes and all that attendant to fracking, they were sufficient to override the voices from the other side saying, yes, but we need the energy. Now, in this country, I think the voice of the Greens is rather weaker than the voices from the other side and the voice of money. Because if there is money to be made from fracking, then I'm pretty darn sure it's going to happen, really. Now, there's not a unified European energy policy I do advise the European Commission. I generally advise them on what projects are worth supporting or not. So I'm an evaluator. The European Commission is a big pot of money, effectively. And people come along and they say, oh, well, we want to build an algal fuel plant. Somebody else, we want a huge solar farm. Somebody else wants, and so on. And you just, a group of about 6 of you have to get together and try and evaluate the relative merits, because you've got, say, 100 million euros in one budget, but you've got 300 applications and they're asking for 3 billion euros, so you've got to really narrow it down that way. I deal mostly on the basic research side of things, but still, some of the projects I deal with, you've got to look at the technical readiness level and the manufacturing readiness level. So if somebody says, well, okay, give us money for 5 years and we'll have at least a prototype, if not a factory, actually producing algal biofuels or something. So it's that kind of thing. So the European Commission is supporting different kinds of projects, and they are into low carbon energy. But I think that there is an awareness that you've got at the moment 2% on one side and 80% on the other. So there's no call, right, 10 years time we're going to phase out the fossil fuels. Although the outcome of the Paris climate change conference, I think that is really making people think, we've really got to change things over the next 20 years. If they want to keep below the 1.5 degree, let alone the 2 degree level, we're going to really have a quite different system in operation before 2050, let alone by the end of the century. So I don't think that's going to happen, but I think things are mostly driven by economics, aren't they, in the global or the capitalist world that we have across the globe. And I think when you have, as an example, the Rockefeller Foundation disinvesting in fossil fuels, probably not entirely altruistically, but they think, well, look at this, it's a really bad business prospect, isn't it? Right, let's go and get into manufacturing solar panels, we'll put our money into that instead. So I think change will come about that way, and then as that change starts to happen, it gathers momentum, then that will change the research policy within the European Commission, and then the money will sort of go away from more efficient coal mining techniques and oil extraction techniques and so on, and more towards renewables and energy efficiency technologies. So I think the whole thing is in flux, basically. And the ideas follow the money, but then the ideas also, the money sort of also follows the ideas. They're kind of hand in hand, basically. So that's my overall impression for what it's worth, yeah. Okay. Yes?
Is there any future, this is sort of a second question, is there any future in burning coal in situ?
Do you mean gasification?
Yes.
Well, interestingly, they experimented on this in the 1950s in Britain, up in Derbyshire. And it seemed to be not economic as yet, but of course, our coal mining industry, it still exists. I think the majority of it now is surface mining rather than the deep mining. But of course, all those mines that were closed up 30 or so years ago, you can't just blast the tops open again, because of course the roads fill up with clay over time. So you really need to completely re-dig the coal mines again. Really not practical. So that makes underground coal gasification look a lot more attractive, because then what you have to do, you basically ignite the coal under certain low oxygen conditions, and it basically itself pyrolyzes. The energy from the coal heats up more coal and turns it into gas, effectively, which you get up to the surface. There are also issues over safety. Once you sort of effectively set light to a coal seam, it's very, very difficult to stop it. And of course, coal is a supporting rock, effectively. So once you dig or you remove the coal through gasification, then you've got a fairly good chance of subsidence happening. People sometimes say, well, tell me this, when they've got all that gas and oil out of the ground, isn't there a big hole? Isn't it going to simply collapse? Well, not really, because they're contained in source rock. So the basic structure remains intact, so it's less of a likely problem. So there are various conundrums, and it's not considered to be economic at the moment. That's not to say that it might not become so as the gas and the oil prices increase. Because the gas and the oil prices have to increase, because at the moment it's too cheap to make it viable to extract and invest in more and more unconventional oil. So for example, if it costs you $100 a barrel to produce oil from fracking, and you can only sell it for 50, it's an absolute no-no. So a lot of the investment is going. A lot of the fracking companies, the smaller outfits, they're going bust at the moment. And what this means, because as I said, we've got this decline in the supply of crude oil already, the regular crude oil. And so far, it's been possible to fill that hole from these unconventional sources. Now, once you can't do that, if the investment isn't going ahead now, then a year or 2 or 3 years down the line, then that oil supply is just not going to be there to take up the slack. And so we're then going to start to see serious issues over the overall oil supply. And that will force the price back up on a sort of supply and demand basis. The thing, of course, is when the oil price is back to $100, everybody goes, right, okay, let's get fracking again. And it's this kind of balance between economics and technology. But I think a severe slowing down of that flow of oil into civilization is going to change things so extremely that it won't be possible to make a knee-jerk reaction and go, right, okay, let's get fracking again. Because you've gone out of business 10 years ago, your equipment's rusty, you don't have the trained personnel. It's not a seesaw. You can't just sort of react one for another. It's like trying to steer the proverbial oil. They don't know what else to do. There is this model we're so familiar with. You don't quite know what else to do. Chapter,
It's always building on that. It's about, you're talking about energy and technology. But a lot of it's saying we need to make changes.
Yeah.
It's not clear who we are or who you are. So in colloquial, you can say you do this, you do that, or we're having this, we're having that. Actually, there are players, there are organisations of people with power, and we have some power. We're not, in the way we're talking about it, we're not seeing who make choices that changes things. Unless we see where we each have the power to make a choice that changes something, we're just repeating theory.
Yeah.
So I'm really interested in what are the agencies, what power do we each have here to change our choices?
I think we're more powerful than we are in many respects, but it needs the change in the mindset to do that. Okay, so for example, for fun, we sort of had a look round at home at how we were doing things. And we managed to save about 1/3 of our use of energy with no particular discomfort. And so, of course, if you multiply that by millions of people, then collectively that could add up to a huge difference. But you've got to have the mindset to do that. But as Alan was saying, if the message is consume, 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 what we need is more and more growth, then nobody's thinking that way. So that is the change you need to have. Or I suppose if energy becomes so expensive that you can't afford it, then you think, oh, cut my energy use by 1/3, bloody hell, pay 1/3 less on the bills, then that's a really strong incentive for doing it. And that could be the change, because economics tends to drive the behaviour of individuals and nations and the world ultimately. So I think that could be it. And I have a horrible feeling that it's almost as though things are a bit too comfortable at the moment. Life is still rolling on okay, we're all right, we've got enough food, I've got some cash in my pocket, I can get the bus back later, etc., etc. No problem. But of course, if things began to change and then suddenly, it really was down to basics, then I think I'd feel an incentive to change my behaviour quite considerably. But yeah, I think sort of generally speaking, okay, as I say, we did this for fun, but I think it's not. What horrifies me is I fear that it's not until things get a lot worse that anything is really going to change significantly. But by that point, of course, then we don't have so much slack in the system. Yes?
Just in terms of electricity generation, and from the point of view of reducing fossil fuel use, cutting down CO2 emissions, do you think generation by wind energy could or should make a significant contribution?
Very controversial, isn't it, wind energy? I think you need to have your turbines in the right place and so on. Although we are, if you look, there's a website, you can look in real time at where the electricity is coming from. It slips my mind what it is. I can certainly send you the link to it. And at times, you can have up to about 8% of our electricity is coming from wind power, under favourable conditions. Integrate that over the year, it's going to be less than that. But that is significant, even if it was a few percent. So, as I say, I think we're going to need an overall energy mix, and renewables, and ideally an increasing level of contribution of renewables, is certainly going to be an important part of that. But yeah, I think where the controversy comes is where wind turbines are not put in the right place. So there's not enough wind, or there's too much, that kind of thing. But of course, these offshore wind farms, they've not been around long enough to know how resilient they're going to be. Because salt water has a horrendous effect on mechanical components. There was a wind farm off Ireland which basically collapsed because the underlying geology wasn't strong enough to support the weight of it. They're damn heavy, these things, the offshore ones, the 5 megawatts, the really big ones. I mean, there are a few hundred tons, I should think, each one of these. So the seabed's got to be strong enough to take it. So there are engineering issues to take account of as well. But yeah, I think probably covering as many roofs as possible with solar panels is an easier approach. But and most of the renewable energy actually is solar, followed by wind. But I would put my money on solar more than wind, actually. Yeah, probably. Okay. Yes.
Some of the sustainable oriented people are quite keen to come, but they've all got other things on today.
Oh, okay.
Is there any way they can see this online?
There may well be.
Yes, we yes, we want to do
put
that.
a link through.
Yeah,
Great.
Yeah. Yeah. Hi.
Just following on from what you said about getting to a crisis, do you see any way of getting our society, mainstream society, to take these issues more seriously before it becomes crisis management and you've got virtually no options left, or are we just going to hit buffers?
I think the big problem is that you've got sort of relatively quiet voices in terms of the number of people talking about, writing about these things, saying what you've just said, hey, we've really got to get it together while there's still time to avert the worst calamity. But then there is the very loud voice of consumerism, which has a lot more money behind it, and I think there is a problem too, that nobody wants to be told, well, you've got to do with less, because there's a bit sort of, well, I don't really quite like that idea. If you've been told consumerism for generations, then it's a very, very difficult thing to do, to turn the mind in the opposite, throw the switch so that the thinking goes in the opposite direction. So as I say, my sort of horrific prospect is no, we are buggered basically. Yeah. Yes.
You mentioned thorium, nuclear energy. I've been involved in a group that's working with the victims of Chernobyl, the children whose life expectancy was not very long, and has moved me very, very tremendously, having seen what can happen. Is there something? I can't imagine anybody recommending nuclear power. Is there something quite different about thorium?
It is safer and it produces less nuclear waste. So it will not be 100% problem free, but it's better than the system we have. And why people are keen on it is because nuclear power is said to be zero carbon, well not quite, but low carbon energy. So from the climate change point of view, that's what stirs people up in the direction of it. But yeah, until we get round the nuclear waste problem, if we ever can, there is always that issue. And I mean, Chernobyl should never have happened. I mean, they did absolutely everything wrong in defiance of all safety regulations. And yeah, they got a hole in the roof, basically. I was in Russia around that time, actually, and we couldn't get any information about what had happened from our Russian colleagues because, you know, it was just keep quiet about it. And we did discover what had happened via the old Janet network, the Joint Academic Network, where we could communicate via computers with our colleagues in other countries. And there was a chap in Sweden told us what had happened, that somebody had gone into work in the nuclear power plant in the morning, set all the alarms off, and they thought, strange, he's gone in. You would expect the alarms to go off when he was walking out of work. And then they realised he was heavily contaminated, and they said, well, where have you been? And he said he'd been hiking in the hills over the last few days, and of course he'd been contaminated by the radioactive plume as it came over from Kiev. But I mean, they didn't call for help at all, the Russians, from anybody else, because they wanted to contain it, because it was a rather embarrassing thing to happen. But it is thought in some quarters that actually Chernobyl, in the example of it, and with everything else that was going on, was like the final nail in the coffin of the Soviet Union, because Gorbachev was saying, well, we can't continue with this arms program, it's taking 60% of the GDP, you know, let's do things differently. But yeah, I have issues with nuclear power, but I can see why it is appealing from the CO2 point of view. I guess there's no...
But there's also, it's very long term, it doesn't address the immediate, and it's very expensive. It takes a lot of energy.
Yeah. I think if they're going to go for nuclear power, what might be the best compromise would be to go for these Generation 4 reactors that actually burn nuclear waste. They can burn a huge mix of things, and at least that way, rather than burying what we've got already in the ground for thousands of years, you can actually destroy it and convert it into energy in the process. I can see some merits in doing that.
Have they got that technology?
It is being developed. You know, it's at the R&D stage.
That's the story.
I don't think they're going to have it for 20 or 30 years. Yeah, no. Right, who hasn't? Right, Woody, you haven't asked.
Well, I'll just say, is there anything we can learn from the Cuban experience? What happened when the Soviet Union collapsed? The oil tap for fertilisation was turned off in Cuba.
That's right.
They went through a horrific time, but out of it came their green revolution.
That's right.
So have we anything to learn?
Yeah, Cuba is a very interesting example. You're probably familiar with the story, but yeah, in Cuba, when communism collapsed, Cuba used to get cheap supplies of oil and pesticides and so forth from the Russians, from the USSR, for maintaining themselves as an outpost, a Soviet outpost overlooking America, basically. Okay, so well, the Russians had other problems of their own, so suddenly they didn't get these supplies anymore. So what they went through was what's called the special period during peacetime, where basically they used permaculture principles and agroecology principles to grow as much food as they could. They tore up car parks and so forth. I mean, they weren't driving around, they didn't have the fuel there for one thing. So they survived this period. And it is said, though, that the average Cuban lost about 20 pounds in weight during this, because they were really down to short rations, effectively. But they're the only country to have survived a peak oil situation. Now, time has moved on, and although they managed to do this, the Cuban economy is really on the skids. They're trying to encourage more investment. The Americans have dropped the sanctions against them, so they want more and more money coming in from outside. And so there's cheap food to be bought in the store on the way home, so people aren't bothering to grow their own food anymore. So that green revolution has kind of gone onto the back burner, at least. Yeah, it's interesting, the transformation in Cuba. But the model that they used certainly could be used again and adapted across the world. Because, okay, a country of what, 3.5 million people, something like that, but they managed to feed everybody. And that in Havana, they could grow enough vegetables to feed the population, basically, which is an incredible thing. And also, Cuba produces more doctors, more medical doctors per 100,000 of population than any other country on earth. So they held their educational system together during this process as well. Yeah. So yeah, I think we can learn a lot from Cuba, both in terms of what they did, but also that when capitalism gets its teeth back in again, that, as I say, when there is no longer the necessity to do these things, then, well, you know,
Sit in the sun.
yeah, sit in the sun, exactly, yes, a lot of sunshine down there. Yeah.
We went to a lecture recently at the Royal Institution organised for the U3A. I always get these mixed up. Now, the atom bomb is nuclear fission?
The atom bomb is nuclear fission.
Right, so we went to a lecture on nuclear fusion and the wonderful international effort. I mean, it's the most... it's the thing that gave me hope.
Yeah, yeah.
There's this enormous international cooperation going on. There's an element of it being developed in Oxfordshire, a huge project down in the south of France, which is only on a tiny scale at the moment. But there is this massive international investment right across the planet to try and get this working on an economic scale. And I really felt that the international cooperation that's going into that, where countries as far apart as China and South America are each contributing a bit towards this. And I really felt that, you know, all is not lost. I don't know what your impression of this is.
Yeah, there's a big project going in the States too, and they're using a version of it called Inertial Confinement Fusion, and other people are working on magnetic containment fusion using these tokamak systems. But even if we suddenly had limitless energy, it doesn't solve the problem of getting through all the other resources, the soil, the water, and everything else. It's not just energy. As I said, that there is a nexus really between our use of energy and our use of water, soil, and all other resources in this very complex global civilization that we are in the midst of. So, yeah, I remember when I was about 10 being told that fusion power would be 30 years away. Well, I'm a little bit more than that now. You know?
Oh yeah, I know it's not going to happen instantly.
But, yeah, okay. Alan, yeah.
Sorry, I just wanted to comment. This is a bit of techno-optimism, though it's not contrary to what I was saying before. Yes, I'm still a radio listener, and yes, within the last 3 or 4 days, there's been a 45-minute Radio 4 programme about exactly this hopeful sounding state of fusion technology, and this completely new circular, semi-underground place which has been excavated in front. But the fusion people are saying, basically, we have done it. We now have done it, but we need the big. We just haven't had the scale until this place is completed. So that sound,
the main thing you have to. You've basically got to have more power coming out of these fusion reactors that you're putting in. And although this has been, because that's generally what has not happened, I mean, even with inertial confinement, you need more power to run the lasers than you actually get out of the thing. And that while they have achieved, I think, the break-even point, it's only for a short time. It's not like a continuous power source, or they can't sort of keep on pulsing for hours or weeks or days. So, well, I suspect the problem is entropy in these systems, actually, but nonetheless, even if it could be done, the scaling up of these and the time that we have left to do this, you know, that's a real limiting
But what cheered me was the international cooperation to try and do something.
And you get international cooperation on something like this, because it's so damned expensive, an individual nation couldn't possibly go for it. But the European Commission could attack something like that, the States of America and so on. But yeah, you do get these things, but how long would it take before the individual nations of the world have each got their units, basically? I think it's a long way off, but yeah, I agree, yeah.
This partly goes back at least to the genesis of modern economics with Adam Smith, where it was convenient to assume that the earth has no value. All value is created through human alteration and manipulation and extraction of it, and this has resulted in a civilization that's taken it quite literally. I think for most of us, at sort of deep emotional levels, we probably feel that money and the economy is much more real than this earth of which we are. Each of us is an earthling who has evolved through beautiful, unimaginably complex processes over long periods of time. And we treat the earth as expendable. So at some point, the earth will treat us as expendable.
And wipe us off, you mean, basically? Yeah, probably. Yeah. Well, I mean, across as far back as people can go, in terms of what's happened with species on the planet, species die out, don't they? And I think it's probably going to be our turn.
Well, I was going to ask you the question, because not so many years ago we had a Glaister lecture which was extremely pessimistic about our future as a race, and by and large your talk has been, I don't know whether optimistic is right, but you obviously tackle the whole thing as a problem solver rather than as a prophet of doom. But one of the things that has come out of it for me is such is the need for consciousness change that I sort of see that there is a real need for a spirituality which is not sort of old age spirituality, but it does seem to me that it's only as demanding a process of spirituality that can actually affect the change in consciousness, for instance, to get people to consume less. And I mean, one of the things I'd love to go away and do after this lecture is sort of read up on how I can consume less. Like you, I come to Braziers by bus, so that's a good start, but it's a very, very puny start, isn't it? So, if I can really monitor my developing consciousness, I stand a much, much better chance of simply consuming less, don't I?
I think most people, because of the pressures of everyday life, they don't really have time to think about this stuff. They're just trying to hang on in there, basically, And the old hamster wheel kind of thing,
Can I just say that I agree with the last speaker. It seems to me the elephant in the room is this the fact that we're talking about replacing the energy that we won't have so that we can maintain the lifestyle that we have. No one really wants to face the fact that we have to live using less energy.
No, we don't. That's right.
Tell that to Donald Trump.
It would be a very unpopular message.
I think David Holmgren that you referred to talks about the scenario of living with energy descent.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, I mean, David Holmgren, he presents four sort of scenarios, doesn't he? The one he calls techno-fantasy, which is where we just increase our use of energy and materials and so on. Yeah, there'll be fusion power, there'll be this, we'll find new sources of whatever. Then the other one, or the opposite one of that, is Atlantis. That's basically game over, sort of collapse of population within a few years, disaster. Then there's green tech stability, And that's where we can more or less carry on as we do now, but we'll have more wind turbines, more biofuels and all the rest of it. And then the other one is basically energy descent. That's the third option. And you've used permaculture as being a transitional approach towards the descent of the pathway. And he says that in the future, a more realistic symbol of the future, rather than a solar panel, is likely to be a tree. Yeah.
So I've got to throw this one in. Where does Mount Tambora come in all this?
Ah, yeah. Well,
Because we haven't had one.
or super volcanoes like the one under Yellowstone Park,
Yes.
for example. Yeah.
Which
Well,
don't use.
I